Hello, Vision Nation. In this episode, we have a special story for our 50th episode celebration. Today, we're talking about none other than John D. Rockefeller, probably the wealthiest dude in all of modern history. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it way more interesting to learn about how someone goes from being nothing to a multi-millionaire, rather than hearing about someone who's already worth 100 million trying to get to 150 million. So in this story, I'm focusing more on John D. Rockefeller's come up from a poor kid with terrible life prospects to being a business magnate and owning the biggest oil refinery in the world. One quick thing, I've converted all the dollar figures in the story to today's dollars to make it easier to follow along. Alright, let's dive right into this epic story. Welcome to Wall Street Vision. This show is on true stories about people making millions. I'm Vlad Dolgochev. This show is for informational purposes only and is not investment advice. Full disclaimer in the show notes. So John D. Rockefeller was born in the late 1830s. His dad was this weird guy nicknamed Big Bill, and let me tell you, this dude was a complete scumbag. Big Bill was a scam artist with zero morals, and he would pull all sorts of shady shenanigans, from selling fake homeopathic medicine to loaning money to farmers at crazy interest rates, with the intention of foreclosing on their farms when they couldn't pay back the loans. And get this, just to give you an idea of Big Bill's parenting skills, he had this game he played with young John D. Rockefeller. John D. would jump out of a high chair into Big Bill's arms, and one day, Big Bill just dropped his arms and let John D. crash to the floor. The lesson, according to Big Bill, was, remember, don't trust anyone completely, not even me. Yeah, this guy was a real piece of work. And to top it off, he also fathered 2 illegitimate children with a family's housekeeper. So that's the kind of household John D. was born into. Lucky for him, his mom Eliza was a very religious woman who focused on being thrifty, working hard, and having perfect self-control. She was the complete opposite of Big Bill. The family moved around a lot in those years, finally settling in Cleveland. Big Bill would just take off for weeks or months at a time, and he set up credit at the local general store for Eliza to use while he was gone. Now this was super stressful for her, so she made a habit of being extremely frugal because she had no idea when the store credit might get canceled. And since they had to keep track of all their expenses, John D. learned to be meticulous with his record keeping from a young age. The Rockefeller kids were always wearing tattered clothes and looking dirty and hungry. But even as a kid, John D. had a knack for entrepreneurship. He would buy candy in bulk, divide it into smaller portions, and then sell it to his siblings at a profit. And when he was 7 years old, he followed a turkey hen into the woods, took her chicks, and raised them until they were big enough to sell. Now, talk about having a knack for making money. When John was a teenager, he pretty much had to be the man of the house since his dad was always off doing God knows what. John D. had to go to school, cut wood, milk the cow, draw well water, tend the garden, do the shopping, and take care of his younger siblings. His plate was full. Now you might think that with all that responsibility, he would stand out from other kids, but not really. You see, later on when he became one of the most famous people in the world, his classmates and neighbors didn't even remember what he looked like or what he was like as a kid. In school, John D. wasn't exactly a savant. He had to work hard to prepare for his lessons, but he did have a knack for math. And thanks to Big Bill being gone all the time, John D. kind of became like a father figure to the family. So instead of doing all the normal teenager stuff, he had this added responsibility. Now, there were definitely some negatives to growing up with a father like Big Bill, but the dude did pass on his love of money to John D. Big Bill was obsessed with making money, and he loved having it and earning it. And John was always thinking about getting rich. That's something he visualized all the time when he was a boy. When people would ask him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he'd reply that he wanted to be a millionaire. I think John D. got an extra motivation to become wealthy because the school he went to was surrounded by kids from wealthy families. And one day, when a photographer came to take the class picture, John D. and his brother weren't even allowed in the photo because their clothes were too shabby. Now, when John D. was a teenager, Big Bill went off to another town and started courting some young girl there. He was 25 years older than her, but she and her parents actually took a liking to him. So, oddly enough, Bill ended up marrying her while still being married to Eliza. And neither wife knew about the other woman. What a crazy situation. John had planned to go to college, but with his father suddenly having the secret second wife, that changed everything. All of a sudden, Big Bill was telling John D. that he shouldn't go to college, and instead, John ended up dropping out of school and enrolling in a correspondence course to learn accounting. He was only 16 years old when he finished that accounting course, and now it was time for him to find a job. And here's how he did it. He took the city directory and got a list of all the biggest businesses in Cleveland. Then he'd go to each firm and ask to speak to the top person, and then he'd do his pitch. He'd basically say, "I understand bookkeeping and I'd like to get to work." Now, a lot of times the top person wasn't available, so he'd pitch the secretary instead. This guy would leave his house in the morning every day, all dressed up in a dark suit and a black tie, and he'd go door to door until the evening. And he did this 6 days a week for over a month. One of the big factors motivating him was the fact that he didn't want to depend on his dad for any money, so he had to find a way to provide for himself. Now, Cleveland was a hub of transportation networks back then, and there were lots of businesses there, but no one wanted to hire a teenager. So when John D. went through all the businesses in the directory, he just started at the top of the list again and went to some firms 2 or 3 times. That gives you an idea for the insane determination this guy had. He had no problem dealing with rejection. And then one sunny fall day, he walked into the offices of Hewitt and Tuttle. These guys were merchants in the food trade. He interviewed with a junior partner, and it just so happened that they really needed help with managing the books for the business. John was so excited. He kept it together after getting the offer, but inside he was super pumped. This was a huge moment for him, and even 60 years later, he still looked back on it as being a crucial time of his life. Getting that first job had such significance for him that he called September 26th Job Day, and he celebrated it every year, way more than he celebrated his own birthday. So John D. worked in a small office, starting each day at 6:30 a.m. and often returning back to the office after dinner. Sundays were dedicated to the church, but other than that, it was all about work, work, work. And the church had this Puritan tilt to it. So John D. wasn't supposed to drink alcohol, smoke, go to the theater, or do any of that fun stuff. Now, the bookkeeping work he did might seem boring to a lot of people, but John D. found it exhilarating. It was his ticket to getting away from his dad's control. Plus, since he helped keep all the household expenses in order, he had a head start on doing the accounting for the business. So he was doing a great job off the bat. And John D. was all about doing everything to the max. When his bosses sent him to pay the bills, he would check and recheck everything with such effort that he'd make everything accurate to the penny. And he was so detail-oriented that he'd find all kinds of mistakes or shenanigans and let his bosses know. And that sort of stuff saved the business a lot of money. John D. found it weird that as a teenager, he was doing a better job with the books than some of the adults that he was working with. And one of the tasks he had was to collect past due bills for some of the rental properties that his boss owned. Now, John was patient and polite, but man, he had the tenacity of a bulldog. This guy would follow up like his life depended on it. 50 years later, he still had nightmares about collecting those bills. But you know what? He was super anxious doing this job. It was probably because he didn't want to get fired and have to rely on Big Bill again. And also, some people at school thought that he was slow and couldn't really cut it in the real world. So he had this chip on his shoulder to prove all of them wrong. Now, the firm that John D. worked at did all kinds of stuff. They traded food, imported iron ore, they dealt with shipping, and they also worked with the railroad and telegraph. They were kind of like a high-tech company back in the day. And this proved super valuable training for John, teaching him all about transportation. He had to figure out complex shipping costs to make sure the really big orders they did were profitable. They paid John D. around $2,000 for 3 months of work. Now, just to give you an idea of how obsessed Rockefeller was about money, one day his boss got this note, which is basically a check, for around $140,000. And his boss put it in a safe. So what does Rockefeller do? Well, he waited for the boss to leave, and then he ran over to the safe and pulled out the note and looked at it. He just couldn't believe seeing that amount of money in one place. His eyes were popping out of his head. That amount of money was a fortune for him. Rockefeller couldn't get over it, and he kept opening the safe to stare at the note throughout the whole day. When he was 16, Rockefeller starts this little notebook he calls Ledger A. This is where he starts tracking all the money he makes and spends. And he also notes any money that he gives to charity as well. So he's all about keeping track of every single penny, and it's a habit that helps him become so rich. And get this, he's so into it that one day he spends around $45 on a pair of fur gloves. And that moment was so burned into his memory that even when he was 90 years old, he still remembered that purchase and how outrageous it seemed at the time. He just couldn't believe that he spent that much money on a pair of gloves. Rockefeller also starts giving to charity early in life. He donates about 10% of his income on average, but sometimes he gives even more. Now, one pivotal moment happened when his church fell behind on their mortgage payments and their creditors were all like, "Pay up or we're going to foreclose on you." The minister needed to raise around $70,000. And he announces this to the whole congregation, but nobody really does anything about it. Everyone's just expecting the next person to fix the problem, right? Well, as some people start leaving the church, Rockefeller goes nuts and he starts hounding them down to commit to donating a specific amount. He even pulls out his little notebook and starts writing down every dollar that people are promising to donate to the church. Rockefeller works his butt off, and a few months later, he raises and collects all of the money. So by the time that he's 20 years old, he's the second most important person in the congregation, right behind the preacher. So you can already see the key characteristics that later made him so successful, right? He worked like a savage, focused all his time on only a few things, and he was also seen as a leader in the community. Alright, so you got this young Rockefeller kid, barely out of high school, making quite a splash. But of course, that wasn't really enough for him. He wanted to make some extra cash, so he started his own trading on the side. He would trade flour, ham, and pork. And when his boss refused to give him the salary bump that Rockefeller deserved, John D. just said screw it, and he teamed up with his buddy Maurice to start their own business. Now, this guy Maurice was a bit of a wild card. I mean, he was Rockefeller's neighbor and friend, but he was also working at a different produce company. But hey, when your friend says that he wants to start a business together, you don't really say no, right? So the two of them invested around $50,000 each to get things off the ground. Rockefeller still had to borrow around $25,000 from Big Bill. And of course, Big Bill charged him quite a high interest rate for that privilege. So Rockefeller was around 18 years old when he started this first business. And this was only 3.5 years after his first job. That's some next level hustle right there. And things were going great for them. They were trading in meat, grain, and all sorts of produce, basically buying carloads of different foods and reselling them. Rockefeller was working hard. He was the first one in and the last one out every day. But of course, nothing ever goes smoothly in business. Just a couple of months in, they were hit with a severe frost that damaged a ton of crops. Talk about a curveball. They got a shipment of beans that were practically spoiled and they were covered in dirt and trash. So they actually had to sort through all those beans by hand in a warehouse, which isn't exactly the most glamorous part of being an entrepreneur. Now, John D. was always pretty good at keeping his cool, even when something really bothered him. He made a point of controlling his emotions and keeping his ego in check. But sometimes he just couldn't help letting it slip. Like one day, he went to the bank to get a loan, and the loan officer turned him down. And John D. shouted out loud, "One day I'm going to be the richest man in the world." He was angry, and he wanted the bank manager to know that he was making a mistake. But then Rockefeller would go home, and at night he'd reflect on his character, and he'd talk to himself, reminding himself to stay balanced and not to get too full of it. His reputation as a good church-going religious guy helped with sales as well, because the older folks in town trusted him and knew that he was a stand-up guy. So Rockefeller did go to the church a lot, and the church was very important to him, but he did use some clever psychological tricks in business. Like, for example, if he needed a loan for $5,000, he'd go around town telling everyone that he needed $10,000. That way, when he'd go to the bank to borrow only $5,000 instead of $10,000, they were way more likely to give it to him. So there was some strategic hustle going on there. And when the Civil War broke out, their business boomed. They made a ton of money during those years. Now, you gotta remember that back then, things were not as advanced, right? So the primary way to light up your home was to use whale oil lamps. And of course, it's really hard to hunt whales for their fat to use for these lamps, right? So that's around the time that kerosene started to become more popular as an alternative because it burned brighter, it was cheaper, and it was also safer. Around this time is when oil was discovered in a town nearby, and the whole region was going through a massive oil boom. Sam Andrews, who was a chemist, he approached John D. Rockefeller and told him, "Listen up, we should be refining oil to make kerosene," and he had his own method for doing this, right? So he talked to John D. about getting into the oil refining biz. Now, John D. is around 24 years old at this point, and he's made some good cash from the grocery business, and the oil industry looked pretty lucrative. So John D. and his partner put up around $50,000 to get into the oil business in the 1860s. Now, you gotta remember that the oil producers are the people getting oil out of the ground, and the oil refiners are the ones converting it to kerosene and gasoline, right? Well, they decided to go into the refining business because it made more sense and it was more predictable than trying to buy land and drill for oil. Drilling for oil is kind of an all-or-nothing game. It's feast or famine. But as a refinery, they had a stable supply of oil producers who needed their services. It was a much more stable business model. And John D. took a lot of time figuring out the ideal spot for their first refinery. He wanted for it to be the best location strategically. And so he picked a spot that had access to transportation with the lakes, and it also had access to a nearby railroad. That was a huge advantage for them because it let them receive oil and send out kerosene for cheaper than a lot of their competitors. They saved a lot of money on transportation because they were so close to those routes. By the mid-1860s, there was this massive rush into the oil refining business. There were like 20 refineries operating in Cleveland. Now, you gotta understand, it was pretty cheap to start your own refinery. It only cost around $20,000, kind of like the cost of starting up a store. And there was a huge demand for kerosene that was growing. So anybody who started a refinery was making a killing. It didn't matter if they were inefficient or incompetent. Anybody that opened a refinery at that time was making money hand over fist. Now, Rockefeller brought him a mentality of not wasting anything to the oil refinery. As an example, he saw this plumber contractor pulling some shady invoices on them, so he fired them and made the plumbing in-house. And then he'd only hire external plumbers on a short-term basis when he really needed one. Now, you can imagine that the oil industry goes through these big booms and busts, because the demand can be unpredictable. But even with all that craziness, Rockefeller never experienced a single year of losses. When people think of Rockefeller, they usually picture him sitting behind a big desk and barking orders at people. But early on in his career, he was out there in the oil fields with his boots on, walking through thick mud and checking up on all his operations. This guy would even rush to the railroads and personally motivate his employees loading up the barrels just to make sure his shipments were exported on time. And this was also a very dangerous business because the firefighting systems they had in place were not that good. And you had spills of gasoline and kerosene all over the place. Fires happened all the time, so it was a really dangerous business to be in. And the financials for the business were really volatile as well. So just to give you an idea, the prices for a barrel of oil would go from $3 to over $300 a barrel in 1861. So it was a speculative business that was going through huge volatility. So at this point, Rockefeller got a few partners working in the business. He had these 3 clerks that were related to each other, and then he had Andrews. That's when they started to disagree on the vision for the future of the business. Rockefeller had a much more long-term view because he thought oil was going to be around for a long time and that this was just the beginning of the oil era. On the other hand, the Clarks, they're much more short-term minded, and they got real angry with him when he borrows big sums of money to expand the business. One of them's even a former prize fighter, and on occasion he'll threaten Rockefeller with violence every now and then. So the two sides are getting on each other's nerves, right? And Rockefeller wants to get rid of the 3 Clark siblings. John D. asks one of the Clarks to sign off on a big loan, and Clark's upset about it. Rockefeller keeps pushing, and it gets to the point where Clark threatens to dissolve the partnership. Now, dissolving it requires unanimous consent from all parties, and Rockefeller sees this as his chance, so he goes to Andrews and convinces him that they should work together and get rid of all the other partners. This is a secret plan that nobody knows about. A few weeks later, Rockefeller has another argument with Clark. Clark says, "If that's how you want to do business, we'd better dissolve this partnership." So young buck Rockefeller invites all the partners over to his fancy house, right? And he pitches this big idea for a massive refinery expansion that's going to require tons of loans. And of course, Rockefeller knows that this is going to upset the Clarks. So the Clarks are totally against this, and they're like, "We need to split up. This is not going to work." But since Rockefeller has everybody there, he makes them say it out loud that they want to explicitly dissolve the partnership. The next morning, he runs to the newspaper and he sticks a notice there that the partnership is dissolving. The Clarks see it and they're flipping out. They're basically saying, "What the hell, John D? We didn't know that this was a serious thing. We're just joking around." But Rockefeller's already got the bankers lined up to give him the loans he needs to take over the business. And here's the thing. He's just a junior partner, and he's much younger than all the other guys. But he's got this knack for planning things out and executing them perfectly. So the way the dissolution works is they have to have an auction, and Rockefeller ends up overpaying for the business by around 45%. But when it's all said and done, he's in control of Cleveland's biggest refinery. He's only 25 years old and he's running one of the biggest refineries in the world. Can you even imagine? So around this time, Rockefeller marries Laura Spellman. They met in high school and kept in touch over the years. She's a thrifty gal, and she's big on religion, just like Rockefeller. They're both against going to the theater or dancing or whatever, because they think it's against church values. Now here's how committed Rockefeller is to his business. On the day of the wedding, he's in the office at the refinery in the morning, and then he has a little celebratory lunch with his 26 employees. But then he tells the head foreman to make sure everybody gets back to work soon enough. And that's how much he was thinking about the business, even on his wedding day. Those years after the Civil War were kind of a weird time, because there's this massive boom happening. It's a lot easier to get rich back then. Property values were going through the roof, and there were plenty of buyers. And on top of that, the US had a property law system that protected landowners and business owners, and there was tons of bank credit available. Kerosene is also becoming really popular. People are using it to light their homes at night, and Europe wants kerosene too. by 1866, more than half of the kerosene produced in Cleveland is going overseas. And Rockefeller keeps finding ways to innovate. For example, at first they're buying barrels to transport the oil. But then Rockefeller's like, screw that, let's make our own barrels. So they make lighter barrels, which help them cut down on transportation costs. And he's also finding markets for oil byproducts like benzene, paraffin, and petroleum jelly. Other refiners just dump that stuff in rivers, but Rockefeller sees a business opportunity there. I'll give you an idea of how obsessed Rockefeller was with saving costs. He's analyzing every single part of the business, and one day he sees a guy making oil barrels, and the guy's using 40 drops of solder, which is this metal that melts easily and helps fuse two metals together. So Rockefeller's like, hey, have you tried using 38 drops instead of 40 drops? The guy tries it and the barrel leaks, so it doesn't work. Then Rockefeller's like, okay, how about 39 drops? The guy tries it and the barrel doesn't leak. This might seem like a really small thing. It's less than a 3% difference. Who cares? But Rockefeller sees it as a big deal because they're selling thousands and thousands of barrels. That's just how his mind works, always looking for a few percentage improvements wherever he can find them. In the early days, Rockefeller has to borrow a ton of capital to keep his refineries running and expanding. Banks aren't too keen on the refining business. They prefer more stable, predictable businesses like railroads. So it's not easy for him to convince them to lend money. But Rockefeller is a crafty guy. If he's on the street and he needs an urgent loan for $15,000, and a banker stops him and asks if he needs a loan for $50,000, Rockefeller would play it cool. Let me think about it for 24 hours and get back to you. He would do stuff like that so he could get the best loan terms. At this point, he's got a really close relationship with the banks, so he can access loans and take advantage of opportunities as soon as they came up. Like when a competing refiner would go up for sale, for example. Around this time was when Rockefeller got another partner. The partner's name was Henry Flagler. And Henry's family invested around $2 million into this new firm that Rockefeller had. So Rockefeller, he's 27 years old and he's already got 50 refineries in Cleveland. Now, Cleveland's a good spot for this sort of thing because it's got railroads and it's close to the Great Lakes, which are good for shipping oil in the summer. So Rockefeller's got some leverage with the railroads, right? He's got a few options for getting his products out there. Now, here's the thing. Cleveland's a crossroad for three major railroads, and one of them is the Pennsylvania Railroad. When it comes to transporting oil, the Pennsylvania has a great advantage because it's so close to the oil fields. So all the refineries in Pennsylvania are technically in a really good spot because they're close to the oil field, so they can get the oil for cheaper. But anyway, there's the showdown happening. The Pennsylvania Railroad's trying to corner the oil transport market, and the other two railroads are worried because the Pennsylvania Railroad's got this big advantage. So Rockefeller, he's watching all this go down, and he decides to get a little sneaky. So he cuts a secret deal with a pipeline network that will give him oil at a huge discount. Now, you might be asking, how did he manage that? Well, he offered one of the other railroads, called the Erie Railroad, more traffic if they go along with the deal. And the Erie is scared of the Pennsylvania Railroad, so they're trying to figure out a way that they can make more money. So then Rockefeller and his partner go to negotiate with a second railroad, and their goal was to get lower rates to send kerosene to New York. And they were successful at that, which is surprising. So you might be wondering, why would the railroads agree to this? Well, they're trying to fight off the Pennsylvania Railroad, but Rockefeller's got some sweeteners for them. He basically agreed to take on legal liability for fires or accidents. He agreed to stop using boats for transport in the summer, which meant that he would do more business with these two other railroads. And he also promised 60 carloads of refined oil every single day. Now, that's a lot of oil, let me tell you. So basically, he promised them specific volumes that would make their lives easier. And it's a win-win for everyone involved. The railroads can get a guaranteed contract. They can cut down their trip time to New York from 30 days to just 10 days. And they can operate a fleet of 600 cars instead of 1,800 cars, so that's a huge win for them. And for Rockefeller, well, he's building up the biggest refinery in the world. At this point, it's 3 times bigger than his next competitor. Now, these deals that he's making with the railroads, they're not exactly legal, but they're also not illegal either. It's kind of a gray area, you know? He's using this leverage to increase his competitive advantage. But he's doing it all with verbal agreements and handshakes. Nobody's signing anything on paper because it would look really bad if people found out. It wasn't actually until 20 years later that all these rebates became illegal. And all through this time, Rockefeller was making tons of money from these types of deals. So he was lobbying hard to make sure that the law banning these sorts of things didn't pass. Anyway, he moved into Millionaire's Row. He buys himself this small 4-bedroom house there for around $200,000. Now, even though he could afford something much bigger, he was trying to be discreet. It's a good house, but it's small compared to the mansions his neighbors are living in. Now, despite all of these kind of cutthroat business things that Rockefeller was doing, at home he was a different kind of guy. At home, he's a committed family man, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't womanize. He's a good father. Of course, in the business world, he's ruthless. There's this saying that goes, to be fiercely revolutionary in business, he needed to be utterly conventional at home. And that's John D. Rockefeller for you. He actually became so wealthy in his late 20s that he took his foot off the gas pedal a little bit. He'd basically nap after lunch and take it easy in a lounge chair after dinner. And this guy also actually had a telegraph wire set up from his house to his office so that he could work from home for a few afternoons each week. He was all about the slow and steady approach where he thought it helped him be more productive. So he was the original work-from-home guy, way before COVID. This guy was all about scheduling and budgeting his time. Every hour was accounted for, and he knew exactly what he had to do. Whether it was to spend time with family, business, religion, or getting exercise. Now, on the outside, he was all calm and stoic. But on the inside, he was constantly stressed out about his business. He had a tough time sleeping because of all the anxiety. So the thing about the oil industry back then was that it was so easy to make money that everyone and their mom was rushing to open up their own refinery. It was common to make 100% of your investment back in like 6 months to a year. The oil producers were making bank as well, which led to the overproduction of oil where a bunch of refineries were losing money. So at one point, oil prices were down and kerosene prices were down as well. John D. was facing all these oil companies that were about to go out of business. He was basically analyzing the whole industry, and it made sense for him to create this corporation or the sort of cartel that would lower the output of oil to keep prices high. The first step was for them to incorporate their business, which they did in 1870, and they called their new company Standard Oil. They chose that name because back then there were all these inferior kerosene products that could cause house fires. They wanted a solid brand that stood for the high quality of their product. Now that they had a corporation going, they could actually raise capital by issuing more shares, and they could also give an incentive to their top managers to perform well by giving them shares as well. Rockefeller also had a really huge vision for this business. He was trying to create this oil cartel that would control the supply of oil in the market. And the cartel would also benefit from economies of scale as well. Now, it's important to note that a lot of people weren't sure if he was going to pull this off. A lot of people thought that he would fail. The price for oil was all over the place. It would fluctuate like crazy, and a lot of Rockefeller's competitors went out of business. Alright, so do you remember that Pennsylvania Railroad that we talked about? So Rockefeller didn't get along with that company. But as he started to gain more power in the industry, he was actually ready to make a deal with them. He wanted to strike a deal because it would make it a lot harder for some of his competitors who were closer to the oil fields. And what ended up happening is some of the railroad owners had actually invested in Rockefeller's company. So they had a secret, hidden, vested interest in Standard Oil doing well. So what they did was they formed the South Improvement Company in 1871. And that was an alliance between the top 3 railroads and some refiners. And that included Standard Oil. The deal was that the railroads would hike freight rates for all refiners, but members of this new company would get massive rebates, up to 50% off. That gave the refiners in the club a huge advantage over their competitors. And get this, the railroads even agreed to pay rebates for oil shipped by refineries that weren't part of the club. So what that means is that Rockefeller's competitors would send oil or kerosene using the railroad, and then Rockefeller would get a cut for each one of those shipments. How crazy is that? Plus, the railroads would give him all the information on their competitors' shipments, and that way he could strategize and try to dominate the industry. And of course, all of this was top secret because it was so sketchy. Alright, so you're probably thinking, why did the railroads agree to this deal with Standard Oil in the first place? Well, back then the railroads were competing against each other like crazy, so freight rates were falling like crazy. That meant that the railroads also needed to form some sort of cartel to control the prices and keep themselves from undercutting each other. It's kind of a similar situation to what the refineries and oil producers were dealing with. And so the railroads basically got together and they worked with Standard Oil being the sort of mediator to make sure that all the railroads would get a certain percentage of the oil traffic. By having the railroads work together with Rockefeller, it gave him a huge advantage over his competitors. The railroads were basically ensuring that Standard Oil would survive in this volatile industry. And they also knew that they'd make a killing once Rockefeller's competitors were out of the game. Now, another important factor was that Rockefeller had bought hundreds of tank cars that could carry oil. And those were always in demand, there was always a shortage of them. But this deal would allow the railroads to use his tank cars for transportation. So let's take a step back and look at the big picture. Basically, the refiners and railroads were dealing with too much oil capacity, and they had these price wars that were killing their profits. Rockefeller wanted to solve the railroads' problems and the refiners' problems at the same time by creating a double cartel in oil and rail. And this plan would help the railroads while also helping Rockefeller. Soon enough, oil transport rates doubled for anyone not part of this exclusive group in the South Improvement Company. There were massive protests against all this, and even threats of violence. Rockefeller became so hated by the public. And this was so publicized that he had to have police stationed outside his office and his house. And he even started keeping a gun beside his bed for protection. There were also tons of oil producers that refused to sell oil to any member of the South Improvement Company. And this had a huge impact on Rockefeller's business. At one point, he had to lay off 90% of his employees. Things got so publicized that the railroads had to back down due to all the political pressure. Now, this whole plan didn't violate any obvious laws, but it wasn't in the spirit of fair play. So basically, Rockefeller and the railroads had to end the agreement. And in the end, not a single shipment was made or a single rebate collected under this plan. It actually never came to be. But it just gives us an idea of how bold Rockefeller was with his business moves. Now, the plan did get shut down because of all the public outrage and because the government got involved. But it actually helped Rockefeller in a big way, because it set him up for what later became known as the Cleveland Massacre. So in just 6 weeks, Rockefeller bought 22 out of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. At the time, the oil and kerosene markets were struggling, and a lot of refiners were losing money. Now, all these refiners heard about the South Improvement Company plan, and they knew that they would not be able to compete with Rockefeller. so they felt a ton of pressure to sell their businesses to him. Now, this is interesting. When Rockefeller started buying up those refineries, he didn't go for the smaller ones first. He started off with approaching the biggest one. He figured that if he could get them on board, the smaller refineries would have to sell too. So Rockefeller was willing to overpay for that first purchase. And after that deal closed, he became the world's largest oil refiner at age 31. Rockefeller would offer these refiners either stock or cash in exchange for the businesses. Now, it seems fair, but if you're a refiner losing money and Rockefeller comes along offering to buy you out, he's not going to give you a great price. He'd usually offer about 25% of their original construction costs, or basically the salvage value if they sold all their equipment as scrap metal. Now, to be fair, he did buy most of those plants and shut them down because his goal was to control the kerosene supply in the market in the first place. But these tactics made him really unpopular with the business owners selling to him. So by age 31, Rockefeller owned the biggest oil refinery in the world. But a lot of people started hating him because of his sketchy tactics. He'd do different sorts of stuff like buying up all the railroad tank cars that transported oil, or he'd go and buy up all the barrels in the market so his competitors didn't have a way to store or ship their oil. He'd even buy up all the chemicals needed to refine oil. These tactics were great for Rockefeller, but they definitely rubbed his competitors the wrong way, and they thought that he was ruthless for using them. Alright, so what happened after Rockefeller pulled all those dirty tricks to grow his empire? Well, eventually people started hating him so much that the government got involved and broke up Standard Oil into all these smaller companies that you know today as Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, and all those. But here's the thing, it turns out that those companies were worth more individually than collectively together. And guess who owned shares in all of them? That's right, it was Rockefeller. So he ended up becoming the wealthiest person in history with a net worth of over $300 billion in today's money. Can you even wrap your head around that kind of money? It's crazy. So since Rockefeller owned shares in all those different companies that ended up getting split out or spun out, he became super wealthy. But let me tell you one thing, Rockefeller wasn't just some greedy person. He was also a big-time philanthropist who donated millions to charitable causes throughout his life. He was big on education and he helped fund the establishment of a bunch of universities, like the University of Chicago, for example. And he gave money to all kinds of other causes as well, like science research and public health and religious organizations. So his philanthropy had a real impact on a lot of different fields, and it helped improve the lives of people all around the world. So this man was every bit as good as he was bad, which makes him so controversial. Alright, Vision Nation, that wraps it up for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please share it with a friend, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have an amazing day. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions. Before making any decisions, consult a professional. I may maintain positions in the securities discussed on this podcast. This show is copyrighted by the Wall Street Vision. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.